You've seen the headlines, you've heard the names, but what's really going on? Psychologically. Today, we're digging deeper than the news cycle, into the very human behavior at the heart of the Epstein case. We're going to break down the psychological forces, the power, the control, the silence that allowed these systems of abuse to operate right out in the open.
So that's the big question, right? When you strip away all the headlines and the sensationalism, what do these fields really tell us about how people think and behave? Because this story, it's not just about one person. It's about these predictable and, frankly, preventable patterns of power and control. It's about the silence that lets it all happen.
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. We'll start with the absolute basics. What are the Epstein files? From there, we'll dive into the mind of someone with unchecked power, look at the mechanics of control they use, and then explore why an entire network of people can stay silent. We'll even touch on why we find these stories so compelling before we land on a really uncomfortable but really important truth.
Okay, first things first. Before we can even begin to talk about the psychology here, we've got to be on the same page about the facts. So when people say the Epstein files, what exactly are they talking about?
Right, so the first thing to know is that the Epstein files isn't some single secret book. It's a huge collection of different legal materials. We're talking court documents, sworn testimonies, those infamous flight logs, all of it connected to the Jeffrey Epstein case. And at its core, this case exposed a truly horrifying system, the organized trafficking and abuse of underage girls. It's really important to understand these weren't random acts. The victims, many from incredibly vulnerable situations, were systematically lured into this web of abuse, a network that was protected by immense wealth, power, and influence. And this is something we have to get crystal clear on right from the start. Just because a name appears in these documents, it does not automatically mean they're guilty of a crime. People are listed for all sorts of reasons. They could be potential witnesses, business associates, or just names in an address book. Think of these files as the beginning of an investigation, not the final word. Okay, so now that we have the what established, let's get into the why. This is where the psychology gets really fascinating and, frankly, pretty disturbing. What happens to a person's mind when they have almost unlimited power and zero accountability? The research here is, well, it's unsettling. You know, psychological studies are really clear about what unchecked power does to a person. It's like it rewires the brain. Empathy, your ability to feel what others are feeling, it just plummets. At the same time, this huge sense of entitlement kicks in. This belief that the rules that apply to everyone else, yeah, they don't apply to you. The normal fear of getting caught, it starts to fade. And here's the kicker. When you keep getting away with risky behavior, your brain learns a really dangerous lesson. I'm untouchable. So if you're living in that reality, how on earth do you justify doing terrible things? Well, there's a psychological tool for that. It's called moral disengagement. It's basically the brain's off switch for its own conscience. It's how people convince themselves that what they're doing is okay, even when it's obviously not. And it usually happens in 3 steps. First, you minimize the harm. You tell yourself it's not that bad, or you frame exploitation as something less severe than it actually is. Then you shift the blame. It becomes the victim's fault, or someone else's fault. And finally, you use euphemisms, softer language. You don't call it abuse, you call it an arrangement. It's a way of putting a linguistic shield between you and the ugly reality of your actions. So that's the mind of the person in power. But that's only half the story, right? The other half is how they control their victims. This isn't just about force, it's about a methodical, psychological strategy of manipulation. Let's break down how that works. The word you'll hear over and over is grooming, and it's so important we understand what this really means. Grooming isn't a single action, it's a slow, calculated psychological strategy. Think of it as psychological warfare that's disguised as friendship or opportunity. The entire goal is to break down a person's defenses from the inside. So how does it play out? Well, it often starts with what seems like generosity, gifts, promises of a better life, making the person feel special. This builds trust and dependency. Then, ever so slowly, boundaries are crossed. It's so gradual that the victim becomes desensitized over time. This leads to this intense state of confusion, where they start to doubt their own perceptions, their own reality. And once that happens, isolation and total psychological control can take hold. And this all leads to that question you hear so often. A question that's honestly really misguided. Well, why didn't they just leave? Why didn't they speak up sooner? And this quote just hits the nail on the head.
Silence is very often a symptom of psychological injury, not consent. Trauma science is incredibly clear on this. When a person is under that kind of extreme, prolonged stress, their brain doesn't operate the way you'd think. That silence isn't agreement, it's a sign of profound psychological damage.
Now, a system like this, it can't exist in a bubble. It needs a network around it. It needs enablers. So the next big psychological question is, what makes a whole group of people see what's happening, see the red flags, and yet do nothing?
Well, it often boils down to two really powerful psychological phenomena. The first one you've probably heard of, the bystander effect. It's that classic, someone else will deal with it thinking. When responsibility is spread out among a group, nobody feels like it's their job to step in. But the second one is even more insidious. It's called pluralistic ignorance. This is when everyone in a group privately thinks this is really, really wrong, but because they look around and see nobody else speaking up, they assume, I must be the only one who feels this way. So they stay quiet to fit in, and the silence becomes unanimous.
Okay, so we've looked at the perpetrator, the victim, and the network. Now let's turn the lens around and look at us, the public. This case has captivated the world. Why? What is it about these dark stories that we just can't look away from? Believe it or not, psychology has some answers for that too. There are a few things going on here. For one, our brains are basically pattern-seeking machines. We're wired to try and solve mysteries, especially when they involve secrets and hidden power structures. Plus, when you have a general distrust of institutions, a story like this fuels all sorts of speculation. But maybe the biggest thing is that it taps into this deep sense of injustice. We have a core belief that society should be fair, that people at the top shouldn't get a free pass. When a story so blatantly violates that belief, it creates this intense, almost obsessive need to understand how and why it happened. So we've peeled back all these different psychological layers. And when you put it all together, we're left with a final and honestly a very uncomfortable truth about what this case really shows us. And here it is. It's really easy, and in a way it's comforting, to just label people who do these things as monsters, as some separate species of evil that has nothing to do with the rest of us. But the hard truth that psychology shows us is that that's a dangerous oversimplification. Because the scary reality is, you don't actually need a monster to create this kind of horror. All you need is a perfect storm of three very human conditions: someone with unchecked power, a supply of vulnerable people to target, and a culture of enabling silence. And that leaves us with this powerful reminder. Accountability isn't some default setting for society. It doesn't just happen. It's something that has to be actively demanded, it has to be protected, and it has to be constantly sustained by all of us. So I'll leave you with this final thought to chew on. This specific system, this network, was exposed. But are the underlying conditions that created it really gone? The worship of power, the exploitation of the vulnerable, the rewards for staying silent. Have we really dismantled those things? That's the real question, isn't it?